The following is a JourneyWise Network production.
Hey friends, I want to welcome you to our JourneyWise podcast. I'm Shane Stanford.
I'm Ronnie Kent.
And I'm James Kent.
We're so excited to be here with you. I don't know about you guys, but I've been pretty good over the course of 30 years of pastoral care, of helping care for other people. I don't have mercy or pastoral gifts as the top of my gifting system. I'm very open about that. I don't tend to, that's not my natural reaction or natural gifting, but I do work at it. And so I think I've done a fair job of that over the course of 3 decades. Where I've been really bad though is in self-care. And not because I intended to do that, but because it got pushed off to the side while I was busy doing other things. It kind of reminds me of Mr. Holland's opus that, while I was busy making other plans, life happened kind of deal. And it took me a while through several major events. And I know what people are thinking. Me of all people, I should have understood this much earlier, but I always took a long time to understand basic things. I was not the sharpest tool in the shed sometimes. And even with all the disease and all of the illnesses, I tended to go the opposite direction. I tended to try to prove people wrong. I tried to say, oh, well, that health issue, that doesn't matter. What matters is me accomplishing this. And so time and time again, I would find myself at a crossroads. And maybe those of you listening are familiar with this crossroads where you're there whether you want it or not. You're going to deal with it whether you really want to deal with it or not, because you are either physically, emotionally, relationally just about broken. And what we want to talk to you about today is how do we do self-care and soul care in a way that doesn't wait until you get to the outskirts of your ability to hang on. How do you do that so that in the regular process of things, you're not playing catch up your whole life with your own care? And so I wanted to start us off, Ronnie and James, with just a kind of a basic definition. This is from the Ecumenical Dictionary of Theology. When it talks about soul care or self-care spiritually, refers to the nourishing of our inner being, taking care of the matters of the heart, which allows us to say to our God, Lord, I trust in you. And it begins with acknowledging one's need for God and to recognize the needs of the other aspects of life, the heart, the body, the soul, the relational life. And so when we're talking about self-care here today, we're talking about those elements of mind, body, soul, and mind, body, soul, and our emotional life, about those aspects that really we have to continue to nurture and care for. We can't just put them over onto the end of a list that we never quite get to. They have to be a priority. Roddy, in your course of practicing medicine, did you ever get to a place where you were so busy pouring out that you didn't pour in enough?
Oh, I think anybody who, especially early on, is concerned about their success is going to sacrifice themselves on the altar of basically ego, let's just face it, and to prove to the world that, I matter, that I'm worthy, that and not realizing that when you sacrifice soul care, self-care, however we want to label it, that you're not only harming the people that you're trying to minister to or help, be that spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically, but you're harming yourself too. And it's a very difficult time. I think I had 2 pivotal things, and I'll tell just the first one was a professional moment, and that is a lady called me at home when I was off, and she said, I would like for you to take, and this was early on, a year or two, kind of after my wife had said, you're not real nice to people when you talk to them on the phone. And it was because I was getting burnt out, and but this lady called and said, I'd like for you to be my child's pediatrician. I said, that's great. I'd love to. And she said, but there's only one thing I want. And I said, what's that? She said, I want you to be available 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I don't want anybody to, take call for you or anything like that. And it was really one of those aha moments when I thought, well, this is just one person and it won't be that hard and there won't be that big a need. And it was as if God said to me, you fool. I mean, basically, who do you think you are? I mean, that you're that important for this child. And, I told her, I said, it'd be an honor for me to be your child's pediatrician and I would develop hopefully a close relationship with that child and his family. But I have a much closer relationship to my own family. And I can't sacrifice them nor, my taking care of myself to do that. So I hope you're able to find somebody that meets y'all's needs, but I'm going to have to decline. And
do you were able to find somebody?
No, not at all.
Yeah, I think so.
Not at all. The other one was the answer to the question, am I going to be a pediatrician using Christian principles to practice medicine, or am I going to be a Christian using pediatrics as my way to minister to the world? And those are two similar statements, but a world apart. And when I finally realized that I'm a Christian using pediatrics to minister to the world, then I was able to do what God told me first instead of what the American Academy of Pediatrics told me first. And he says to love your neighbor as yourself. And so I have to love myself and take care of myself as I'm loving my neighbor and loving him.
There are some traditional ways that we talk about disciplines of self-care, such as, some people use meditation, others, it's very much prayer within the Christian community or Christian setting, scripture reading, study, reflection, listening to inspirational music, various inspirational talks. What would you say, though, James, about your own walk and about what are the most important elements of self-care?
Well, before I answer that question, I would just maybe suggest a little bit of clarification, because we're really talking about two different terms. So far, the conversation has mostly encompassed what is known as soul care, and we haven't necessarily delved into self-care. So self-care is much more a pop psychology term, and what we've been talking about is the spiritual component of self-care, and most Christians are, and rightly so, focused on that aspect. And you just listed a number of spiritual disciplines that can be options based on what you like in terms of your spiritual component of self-care. But when we talk about self-care, we're really talking about 7 domains of functioning. So you have sleep, diet, and exercise, which are 3 that I think most people are familiar with. And then you have the spirituality component, which, again, to me is, or for all of us as Christians, is the most important. But then you also have intrapersonal and interpersonal. So, for example, social support, relationships is part of your self-care. Intrapersonal self-awareness is part of your self-care. How do you respond to your own emotionality when it happens? That can be healthy or unhealthy. And then you have things like relaxation, stress relief, those life-giving hobbies that you have that, as a side note, are typically the first things to go when your margin starts to shrink, and you don't have enough time, that horrible 4-letter word, right? And so just to clarify, and I think that this happens in the church, I think this is really salient for our conversation here today. When we think of self-care as Christians, we tend to automatically go in the direction of spiritual formation, which is extremely important. But as Christians, oftentimes what we struggle with are things like sleep, diet, and exercise, or even making time for relationships. I remember seeing a talk that was given by a pastor, in his mid 50s, I would say. That's just me judging based on appearance, but he was extremely active. He had all of these ministries that he was a part of, early riser up at 5 a.m. in the Word, passionate about what God was doing, with him and in the ministries he's involved in. And it, everything that came, he was excited about, and he would say yes. But as he told the seminary students his story, he said, "Look, something began to happen to my body, and it started to reject me." And his spirit was intact, his spirit was fine, but his mental, emotional, physical ability started to decline, to the point where he would lay in bed and kind of, shake and have convulsions. And finally, he was diagnosed with a major depressive episode. And it was very interesting to hear him, I would say a high level producer, very energetic, passionate person, for, doing everything for Jesus and in his name, who was taught a real lesson by his body and by his mind that we have limits, and that I think God gave us those limits, not only as a source of humility, but also because those limits reflect a piece of who God is. Not that he's limited, but I think the fact that he required us to sleep, the fact that he requires us to be in relationship, fellowship, I think these things reflect part of who God is. Sleep very easily correlates with a Sabbath rest. And so I'll digress, but just to clarify that there are two different things that are commonly talked about: soul care, self-care. Also, as Christians, I think we, not all of us, but we have a tendency to prioritize spirituality, but not prioritize things like diet and exercise.
I think it's good because I do think that one aspect, I think, where soul care and self care come together is in this idea of identity, knowing who you are, what your limits are, what you can do, what you can't do. There's a sense of clarity that happens, I know, with people who seem to have this under control, or at least giving it regular attention. And therefore, every other aspect of their life seems to be healthier too. So I'm glad that you've made this distinction. James, what do you think is the most difficult or the greatest deficit when it comes to self-care that we experience, regardless of our faith background or economics or whatever it might be? What is the thing that tends to be the greatest detriment?
Well, I think Paul summed it up great when he said, "I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I do want to do." I think there are two aspects that come to mind with your question. One of them is just simply, why do humans struggle with motivation? Because we know what's healthy, we know what's good for us, and we still don't do it. And the second would be, I think that your temperament, your personality, how you're designed, is going to make some of these more difficult for who you are, how God's made you. Whereas other people won't struggle with it at all. It'll be something that comes natural to them. And but they'll have their own struggle. And so, a high level leader who's on the go a lot is probably he's going to struggle more with like relaxation, stress relief, just taking time to be still, not doing anything. But part of that is probably has a really creative mind that's always going. And so again, like anything, it requires motivation with discipline over time.
Maybe answer it this way then. I think for those who are listening, they've heard, I'm sure everybody on this planet's heard diet, sleep, those types of things when it comes to self-care. And I'm kind of viewing this the way I view theology and doctrine a lot of times now. Not just, we know what we're supposed to do, but maybe talk about why it is important to do that particular aspect of self-care. Why is it that diet is so important? It's not just because you need to eat right, but there's something that's happening physically. So, Ronnie, what would you say to somebody as the why?
Well, I talked about this in my office every day, multiple times every day, because in particular, a lot of my patients were teenagers and they, you know, like James said, they might be pretty good in one area, but usually there were two areas. I mean, a fair number of teenagers are involved in sports and things like that, and so they get pretty good exercise. Not all do, of course, but I'm going to tell you, as far as diet and sleep, they were
Mm.
pitiful most of the time, and I would tell them that your body is designed in a certain way. And take, for instance, just eating a high sugar content. Actually, and I'll back up and say why in a minute, but actually has been shown to actually inflame the brain.
Mm.
And obviously, an inflamed brain, just like an inflamed joint or anything in the body, does not function well.
Mm.
And the reason for that is that glucose is the primary metabolite of the brain, the energy source of the brain. And
Mm.
so the blood-brain barrier that keeps bad things out of the brain does not touch glucose. It goes straight in. So whatever
Mm.
your blood sugar is what your brain sugar is. So
Oh,
you eat
wow.
a high glucose meal or snack, it energizes the brain and causes it to really get in a state of heightened awareness, which is okay, but can wear the brain out. Well, then the pancreas says, wait, that's too much sugar. So I need to squirt out some insulin. So it squirts out insulin. And then that drops the blood sugar, can be
Mm.
fairly dramatically. And that same glucose comes right back out of the brain. So the brain is in this high energy, low energy, high energy, low energy. And you can just imagine if one of the hardest things about some sports, take soccer, is that you sprint, you stop, you sprint, you stop. and
Mm.
and so in doing that, the brain is not able to get into a even flow on
Mm.
how it deals with the life around it. So just that one little detail, and it's much more complicated than that as far as diet is concerned. And we know about all those different things now that foods contain that affect the brain. So
Mm.
diet and then sleep is actually more important than diet, because that's when the brain actually resets so many of the chemicals and gets them back into a way to function. And the other chemicals, there's cortisol in the body and adrenaline's in the body and the serotonins and acetylcholine, the whole thing. It's now well documented what happens during sleep and how detrimental it can be for you to not get adequate sleep. And it spiritually, that goes, like James says, back to the Sabbath rest. And
Sure.
so, and it is so hard for people not to sacrifice those two things for other things that they think, because it's that old adage, they sacrifice the ultimate for the immediate. It's
Mm.
what's in front of us so many times that cause us to make decisions about what we do. And many times that's not good for self-care, soul care.
So I love that, because I think to me, having a conversation about, well, I've always heard you need to do this, you need to sleep well, you need to sleep 8 hours. But when I got into a situation where I wasn't sleeping, it was helpful for me to understand what the rest of my life, how it was being affected, how my body was being affected, my relationships, my ability to think correctly, because I wasn't getting enough sleep. And it has this ripple effect throughout not just your sleep patterns and even your physical well-being, but it does affect the whole. Talk about, James, some of these other aspects of self-care, the why behind those are the reason those are needed and important to the whole of our identity and our person.
We were born to be relational, well, and even God Himself is relational within the Trinity. And
Yeah.
um, we can look at old Adam, and it was just inadequate when God made him, and He knew he needed a helper, a mate, and that wasn't just procreation; it was also fellowship. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
so he looked and saw there was nothing adequate to engage in fellowship with Adam. So obviously we have a biblical reason to believe in fellowship.
James, talk about the epidemic of loneliness that we have in our country right now and what the effect of that is on the health of our society. Because I think a lot of people on listening will understand that. We've all been lonely, we've all had those situations, but talk about just the effects of being in fellowship counters the loneliness aspect and why it's important for us to take that seriously.
Some of the most lonely environments or times you feel the loneliest is in a room full of people. And so I guess to clarify, when we say fellowship, I don't simply mean being social, going places where there are people, but having, you know, solid Christ-centered relationships,
Doing life with someone that,
doing
yeah,
life, having fun, being sad with people.
yeah,
It involves all the emotions, not just the good ones, but loneliness. And the pandemic was very, very difficult for many reasons. And I think one of the most significant reasons was the loneliness factor. And the data is still out to, to some degree, but anecdotally, I think we can all agree that it wasn't a great time for fellowship
yeah,
during this
yeah.
pandemic. So I think there are so many people in our country too, and it always comes back to this, but it's a problem our society has yet to fix. But we mistake a screen for true interaction, whether it be Facebook or Instagram or social media. We feel we are connected when we are not really connected, or we think that we're truly doing life with people when all we really get is probably the best snippets, snapshots of their life.
Mm,
And we're really not in relationship. So I
sure.
do think it's an epidemic. It's very sad. But it's also something that isn't, it takes a ton of courage, but the plan to work through it is not a hard one, to work to figure out, if you will. I mean, if someone out there is listening to this and they're lonely, you need to tell somebody, and that's where it starts. Is the person that you trust. You need to tell them, "Hey, I'm struggling. I'm feeling lonely." I would
Mm,
bet you probably half of the people on the hearing side of that are going to say, I struggle with that too.
mm,
Um, and so just know that you're not alone. And if you don't have somebody that you feel like you can reach out to, that's where your local church is ready and waiting for you.
mm.
And you go sit down with that pastor, and you don't leave their office until they've gotten you connected with at least one or two different ministries or people that you can start to engage with, and from there it'll be off to the races if you'll commit to that. So
That's
um
good. So as you go a little bit further into this, and we only have a couple of minutes left, we've had a great conversation here. Um, Ronnie, what would you say um, to parents, or to, particularly, because I've been really concerned about the number of issues we're starting to see in society that are being directly laid at the feet of the parents. Some of those are accurate. I think some of those maybe are not so accurate. But I think there's a lot of parents out there who themselves are not doing a very good job of self care, that then is very much affecting their children, they're affecting their marriages. What would you say to parents in particular about the importance of this issue?
Well, I mean, you're so right. First off, parents need to love their child as they love themselves. And so they really do have to take care of their self-care. And sometimes that does the opposite of what you think it might mean. And that is, you need some alone time. You need
Mm,
some time for yourself. You need some time with your spouse that
mm,
does not involve the child. And if you say, well, that's expensive, I can't do, swap out. Dump your kids on somebody else and let them dump theirs on you. But you do need to take care of yourself. And then number two is that the thing that makes children uh, feel that they're not alone, that they have good quality to their life, is that the parent helps them see the significance of their life in the parent's life. Number one
mm,
way for that is with time. The number two way for that is to listen to your child. When you're spending time with them, don't always be instructional. Number three is to value their input into the family. And when there's a decision to be made, ask people's opinions. And if possible, go with the kids some, help them make the decisions. And number four is ask them what they think would make their family better. That's kind of with number three. But, let them be a part of not just the following the rules, but actually making the rules. And so take care of yourself, but also do things that are straightforward and helping take care of your child too.
I think that there's a beauty to this formula that if you look through Scripture, you see, for instance, Paul talk about this. That there were times that, or talk about with the life of Jesus, there were times where he was in the middle of the crowd, and there were regular times that he went away to be with just the Father. There were times that you could tell he was hungry, and he was not only going to eat himself, but he was feeding the masses. There were times when he did not engage in the physical hunger, because he had a different type of hunger that he needed to take care of. And you see this throughout the life of Jesus.
In Luke, which is 24 chapters, and really the first four are about, other things. And then finally in about chapter 5, it's when Jesus starts his ministry. And so over about the course of 20 chapters, Luke, the physician, records Jesus retreating for solitude over 30 times.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was often for solitude or prayer or who knows what. But I thought it was especially salient. Luke, the physician who was thinking mind, body, soul, spirit, probably more so, or I would speculate more so than others. 30 times over 20 chapters is significant.
Yeah, that is significant. Yeah. And I think it highlights what we've been saying, that, self-care is not a sign of weakness. It is not supposed to be a sign of our inabilities. It is very much a part of the life experience that helps us to be strong in our abilities and in the things that we're called to do. And Jesus, as he does with so many things, models it for us. And I think that is so critical. This is a good discussion. I think this is one we ought to visit on a regular basis, guys, because I know that a lot of people in my life, a lot of people that you guys run into, we know of many examples of people who are really struggling with this. I've struggled, as I said, in the past. I feel myself sort of moving up to the cliff on a regular basis. And it's an important conversation, because I do think, as James said a minute ago, it has a ripple, it has an effect on so much other of who we are and what we do. So, well, James, Ronnie, thank you. Friends, go to JourneyWise.network. You'll be able to find not only this podcast, but other podcasts on our network. We also have something called the prayer wall that you can find at JourneyWise.network. And that prayer wall is monitored. And so we encourage you to send your prayer request. You can do it anonymously. You can send it only to our prayer folks, or you can let everyone on the prayer wall pray for you. But I want to encourage you to go and to do that, because I think that is one way that we can be constantly in conversation about health and be mindful of who we are and what we're doing and what we need to do better. Hey guys, it's Shane. We're so excited that you're on this journey, and we want to thank you for joining us. If you like what you hear, it would mean a lot if you'd subscribe to the podcast and give us a 5-star rating and review. And of course, stay tuned to all that God's doing and working to make all of us JourneyWise.